The Bounty Hunters Ward, Montana Territory, winter 1885. The wind carried the promise of snow as Josephine Clark crouched to examine the tracks leading toward the isolated cabin. There were fresh prints, a man's boots, stumbling slightly. Her quarry was weakening. Jo straightened, adjusting the Winchester rifle slung across her back. At 34, she moved with confidence that had earned her a fearsome reputation across 3 territories. Her dark hair was pulled back beneath a worn slouch hat, and her duster concealed both her figure and the array of weapons she carried. The cabin sat in a small clearing, smoke curling thinly from its chimney. Eddie Tate, who was a bank robber, murderer, and the subject of a $500 bounty. He had been on the run for 3 weeks. But no one escaped the woman some called the Black Widow bounty hunter. She always collected her prey. The first snowflakes began to fall as Jo approached. Wind moaned through the pines, promising the blizzard that had been threatening for days. She needed to conclude this business quickly. Drawing her Colt revolver, Jo approached from the blind side of the cabin. The door stood slightly ajar, careless for a man on the run. She pushed it open with her boot, weapon raised. The stench hit her first, sickness and death. In the cabin's single room, a figure lay motionless on a crude bed. Jo moved closer, keeping her gun trained on the still form. Eddie Tate's sunken face was unmistakable from the wanted poster, but his eyes stared vacantly at the ceiling. The bounty was already dead. "Damn it," Jo muttered, reaching to check for a pulse she knew wouldn't be there. The skin was cool but not cold. Dead less than a day then. The telltale blood-stained handkerchief beside him and the wasted appearance suggested tuberculosis had claimed him before justice could. A small sound, barely perceptible, made Jo spin, gun raised. The corner of the cabin was cast in shadow, but her trained eyes caught movement beneath a rough-hewn table. She approached cautiously, then crouched to peer into the darkness. 2 frightened eyes stared back at her. A child, a girl no more than 7, was huddled there, thin arms wrapped around knobby knees, her face smudged with dirt and tears. "Come out," Jo commanded, her voice firm but lowered. "I won't hurt you." The girl didn't move, didn't speak, just stared with those enormous eyes in a too thin face. Jo holstered her weapon with a sigh. This complicated matters. She glanced back at Eddie's body, then to the child. There was no resemblance. Was she his daughter, a victim, a hostage? The windows rattled as the wind picked up, and Jo moved to look outside. The snow was falling faster now, visibility already poor. The smart decision would be to collect proof of Eddie's death and ride out immediately, but the storm made that impossible. But she was trapped here, with a corpse and a child that wouldn't talk, until the blizzard passed. Jo searched the cabin methodically, as much to assess her situation as to locate Eddie's stolen money. The girl remained under the table, watching silently. The cabin was sparsely furnished. There was the bed where Eddie lay, a small table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and shelves holding meager provisions. A trunk contained clothing, men's and, oddly, a few girls' dresses too fine for a frontier child. Prying up a loose floorboard beneath the bed, Jo found what she sought. A canvas bag containing just over $200. It was less than reported stolen from the Clearwater Bank, but enough to confirm she had the right man. As she replaced the floorboard, she noticed a small carved wooden horse lying, forgotten beneath the bed. Jo retrieved it, turning it over to find a name etched into the base. Sarah. She approached the table again, crouching to the child's level. "Is your name Sarah?" she asked, holding out the toy. The girl's eyes fixed on the wooden horse, but she made no move to take it. No response to the name. Jo set the toy within reach and turned away, allowing the child space. Outside, the storm howled in earnest. Jo dragged Eddie's body outside, since no child should share space with a corpse. She covered it with a tarpaulin behind the cabin. The bitter cold would preserve it until she could transport it for bounty collection. Back inside, she stoked the dying fire and assessed their food situation. Beans, some jerky, coffee, and flour. Enough for a few days if it was rationed. She'd need to hunt if the storm lasted longer. "You should eat something," Jo said to the still hidden child. She placed a plate of beans on the floor near the table. "I'll be here until the storm passes. Then we'll figure out what to do with you." As darkness fell, Jo kept watch from a chair position to observe both the door and the child. The girl hadn't touched the food. She hadn't moved. The howling wind and occasional creak of the cabin's timbers were the only sounds. Jo had just begun to doze when a heavy pounding at the door jolted her awake. Her gun was in her hand before she was fully conscious. The child had vanished from beneath the table. The pounding came again, weaker this time. Not the rhythmic confidence of law enforcement or the demanding strikes of criminals. Someone desperate. Joe moved silently to the window, peering through frost-edged glass. A figure slumped against the doorframe, barely visible through the swirling snow. She located the child, who was now huddled in the corner behind the stove, and motioned for her to stay down. Gun ready, Joe cracked open the door. A man collapsed across the threshold, snow swirling in around him. Blood darkened the side of his sheepskin coat. As Joe dragged him inside and kicked the door shut, firelight illuminated a silver star pinned to his chest. A marshal. This night was getting increasingly complicated. "Either shoot me or help me, ma'am, but close the damn door." The marshal gasped through gritted teeth. The blizzard's bad enough without inviting it inside? Joe had already secured the door against the howling wind. She kept her Colt trained on him as she used her boot to roll him onto his back. Blood stained the floorboards beneath him. "You're shot," she stated flatly. "Your powers of observation are remarkable," he replied, then winced as he tried to sit up. Despite herself, Joe's mouth twitched. She checked his holster, which was empty, and then patted him down, removing a knife from his boot. Only then did she set aside her gun and kneel to examine his wound. "I need to see how bad it is," she said, reaching for his coat buttons. His eyes, alert despite the pain, finally focused on her face. Recognition dawned in them. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "The Black Widow herself." Joe's hands stilled momentarily. "You have me at a disadvantage, Marshal." "Reed. Nathan Reed." He grimaced as she opened his coat to reveal a blood-soaked shirt. "I didn't expect to find Josephine Clark in Eddie Tate's hideout." "Eddie's dead," Joe replied, tearing the shirt to expose the wound. "Tuberculosis got him before either of us could." The bullet had entered his side and exited cleanly, missing vital organs but leaving him weak from blood loss. Joe worked efficiently, cleaning and bandaging the wound with supplies from her saddlebag. Marshal Reed watched her with interest despite his pain. "You've done this before?" he observed. "I've taken enough bullets to know how to tend them," she answered shortly. "What happened to you?" "Ambush. 2 men. I've been tracking Tate for months, but someone else found him first." His gaze drifted around the cabin. "Where is he?" "Outside. I'll collect the bounty when the storm breaks." The marshal's eyes focused. "That bounty is under federal jurisdiction." Joe finished tying the bandage with a sharp tug that made him wince. "I tracked him for 3 weeks and found him first. The bounty's mine." "We'll discuss that when I can stand without bleeding out," Reed conceded grudgingly. A small sound from the corner drew both their attentions. The child had emerged slightly from behind the stove, watching them with wary eyes. "Who's the girl?" Reed asked, his voice softening. "I don't know. Found her here with Eddie. She won't speak." Joe stood, wiping blood from her hands with a rag. "Her name might be Sarah." The marshal's expression changed. "Sarah?" He studied the child with new interest. There was a little girl reported missing after the Clearwater robbery, the bank teller's daughter. Coleman was his name. Joe retrieved the wooden horse and held it out toward the child again. "Sarah Coleman?" For the first time, the girl's expression changed. There was a flicker of recognition before she retreated further behind the stove. "She witnessed the robbery," Reed said quietly. "That's why Tate took her." "She could identify his partners." Joe's eyes tapered. "Partners who are still out there?" The marshal looked grim. "And if they know she's alive, they'll be coming for her." Outside, the blizzard raged, sealing them all in together. Joe glanced between the wounded lawman and the traumatized child, a familiar weight settling in her chest. She'd come for a simple bounty and instead found herself responsible for 2 lives as danger approached through the storm. By morning, the blizzard showed no signs of abating. Marshal Reed had developed a fever during the night, muttering occasionally in restless sleep. Joe kept the fire stoked against the bitter cold seeping through the cabin's walls. The child, Sarah, had finally crept out to take the wooden horse while Joe pretended not to notice. She still wouldn't speak but had accepted a blanket and some food. Progress of a sort. Joe found a piece of paper and a stub of pencil in Eddie's belongings. She placed them near Sarah. "Can you write your name?" The girl stared at the paper but made no move to take the pencil. "What about drawing?" "Can you draw what happened at the bank?" Sarah remained motionless for so long that Joe thought she wouldn't respond. Then, slowly, the child reached for the pencil and began to make marks on the paper. Jo busied herself checking the marshal's wound, giving Sarah privacy to draw. Reed's eyes fluttered open as she changed his bandage. "The girl still is not talking?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "No, but she's drawing something." Reed tried to sit up, wincing with the effort. Jo reluctantly helped him, propping him against the wall. His face was flushed with fever, but his eyes were clearer than the previous night. "How bad is the storm?" he asked. "Bad enough. We're not going anywhere for at least another day, maybe more." Sarah approached cautiously, the paper clutched in her small hand. She stopped several feet away, extending the drawing toward them. Jo took it gently. A crude but recognizable depiction of men with guns inside what appeared to be a bank. One figure lay on the floor, while a small figure, presumably Sarah, hid under what might be a desk. "She was there," Reed confirmed, studying the drawing. "She saw everything." Jo handed the paper back to Sarah. "The man on the floor. Was that your father?" The child's eyes welled with tears, but she gave a tiny nod. It was the first direct response she'd shown. "And Eddie Tate took you after?" Reed asked softly. Sarah clutched the wooden horse tighter, but didn't respond. "Did Eddie hurt you?" Jo asked, a protective edge entering her voice. Sarah shook her head. "It looks like he might have taken her to protect her," Reed suggested. "Maybe had a conscience after all." "Or he was using her as insurance against his partners," Jo countered. She'd seen too much of humanity's darkness to believe in convenient redemption stories. Reed's expression hardened. "Either way, those partners will want to eliminate any witness who can identify them." Jo looked grim. "And we're sitting in the first place they'll look." The day passed slowly. Jo convinced Sarah to eat more, and the child gradually began accepting her presence, though she still kept her distance from the marshal. Reed's fever broke by afternoon, leaving him weak but lucid. The forced proximity created an uneasy alliance as they assessed their situation. "Two men," Reed explained as they shared a meager supper of beans. "Silas Grady and Hank Weber, career criminals." The Clearwater job was their biggest score of over $2,000. Eddie only had 200 hidden here, Jo noted. His partners likely cheated him. It might be why he ran with the girl. Reed watched Sarah, who sat near the stove clutching her wooden horse. She's the only witness who can place them at the scene of a murder. Jo had positioned herself where she could monitor both the door and the single window. If they know Eddie's dead, they'll come looking for her. And the money they think he took? Evening brought no relief from the storm. Jo checked their provisions with growing concern. If the blizzard continued much longer, food would become a problem. While Reed rested, Jo approached Sarah again. The girl had been watching her intently throughout the day, studying her movements with solemn eyes. "You should sleep," Jo said, awkward with the gentle tone that felt foreign in her mouth. She indicated the small pallet she'd made near the stove. "It's warmer there." To her surprise, Sarah moved to the pallet and lay down obediently. The child still clutched the wooden horse in one hand. Jo hesitated, then drew the blanket over the thin shoulders. "I'll keep watch," she promised, unsure why it mattered that this silent child believe her. After Sarah fell asleep, Jo returned to her chair near the door. Reed was awake, watching her with an expression she couldn't interpret. "What?" she asked defensively. "Nothing." A pause. "You're good with her." Jo snorted. "I'm terrible with children." "She trusts you?" "She won't come within 6 feet of me. She's just scared of men, which is understandable given what she's been through." Reed shifted, wincing at the pain in his side. "Most children are scared of you too, I'd imagine. The fearsome Black Widow?" Jo didn't respond. She'd cultivated that reputation deliberately, finding it useful in her profession. It was better to be feared than desired or dismissed, which were usually the only options available to a woman alone. "How did you become a bounty hunter?" Reed asked. "By being better at finding people than most men with badges," she replied shortly. "Get some rest, Marshal." "I'll take first watch." To her relief, he didn't push further. Soon his breathing deepened into sleep, leaving Jo alone with her thoughts and the howling wind. She found herself watching Sarah's small form, the gentle rise and fall of the blanket. Children had never been part of Jo's world. After Daniel was murdered, she'd abandoned any such notions, along with her former life. Sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford in her line of work, yet something about this silent, traumatized child tugged at places Jo thought had scarred over long ago. When Sarah whimpered in her sleep, Jo moved instinctively to her side. The girl's face was contorted in fear, small hands clenched into fists. A nightmare. "Shh," Joe whispered, awkwardly touching the child's shoulder. "You're safe." Sarah's eyes flew open, wild with terror. Before Joe could react, the girl launched herself forward, clinging to Joe with surprising strength. Joe froze, arms held away from the small body pressed against hers. Then, slowly, she brought her hands down to encircle the trembling child. "It's all right," she murmured, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "Nothing's going to hurt you." Across the room, Reed was awake, watching silently as the fearsome bounty hunter rocked a frightened child back to sleep. 3 days into the blizzard, they settled into an uneasy routine. Reed regained enough strength to move around the cabin, though the wound still limited him. Joe ventured out briefly to hunt, returning with a rabbit that supplemented their dwindling supplies. Sarah remained silent but had begun following Joe around the small cabin, watching her every move with intense concentration. When Joe caught Reed looking through her saddlebag, she moved swiftly across the room. "Looking for something, Marshall?" Her voice was dangerously soft. Reed held up her leather-bound journal, open to a page of detailed sketches, buildings and landscapes rendered with surprising artistry. "You're talented," he said simply, handing it back. "I wouldn't have expected that." Joe snatched the journal, tamping down her irritation. "It helps to remember places and faces in my line of work." "Is that all it is?" His perception was unsettling. Before she could respond, Sarah tugged at her sleeve. It was the first time the child had initiated contact. She held up a new drawing. 3 stick figures standing together outside a cabin. "Is that us?" Reed asked, crouching down, despite the pain it clearly caused him. Sarah then pointed to each figure in turn. The tallest wearing what appeared to be a hat, Joe, a middle figure with a star on its chest, Reed, and a small figure between them. "That's very good," Joe said, surprised by the child's perception. "You're quite the artist yourself." Sarah's face remained solemn, but she stayed close to Joe for the remainder of the day. That evening, Joe found herself telling the girl a story as she tucked her in, an adventure tale her father had once told her, modified to feature a brave little girl who outsmarted villains. Reed, pretending to doze by the fire, watched through half-closed eyes. When Sarah finally slept, he spoke quietly. "You're full of surprises, Miss Clark." Joe bristled. "Don't read too much into it." "Children need stories to sleep." "Of course." His tone remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he saw more than Joe wanted revealed. How did the fearsome Black Widow come to know children's bedtime requirements? Joe stoked the fire with unnecessary force. "I wasn't always a bounty hunter, Marshall." "Nathan," he corrected. "After 4 days in a blizzard, we might as well use names." Joe hesitated. "Then what brought you to this godforsaken place, Nathan?" "Besides Eddie Tate?" His expression darkened. "Justice. The man killed at the bank, Sarah's father, was a good man. Left behind a wife, too, besides Sarah. Mrs. Coleman died of grief 2 months after the robbery, they say." "And Sarah has no one else?" "None that we found." He studied Joe's face. "What will you do with her when the storm breaks?" The question had been haunting Joe since discovering the child. Take her to the nearest town with a proper authority. Someone who can find her a home. And then collect your bounty and move on to the next target? There was no judgment in his voice, merely curiosity. "That's my job," Joe replied defensively. "It's what you do," he acknowledged. "But is it who you are?" Joe didn't answer, unsettled by how easily this man seemed to see past the carefully constructed walls she'd built around herself. Instead, she took her position by the window, watching the endless snow and wondering why the prospect of returning to her solitary existence suddenly felt hollow. On the 5th morning, Joe woke to silence. The constant howl of wind had ceased. Sunlight streamed through frost-covered windows, blindingly bright against the snow. "Storm's broken," Nathan observed, already up and moving more freely than the day before. "We should be able to travel tomorrow once the snow settles." Joe ignored the unexpected reluctance she felt. 5 days in this cabin had created a strange intimacy between the 3 of them. It was a false reality that would dissolve once they returned to civilization. Sarah seemed to sense the impending change. She stuck especially close to Joe, clutching her wooden horse and the rag doll Joe had fashioned for her from scraps of fabric. During the night, Joe had caught the child crawling into her bedroll, seeking warmth and comfort that Joe found herself providing without hesitation. "I'll need to retrieve my horse from the shelter I built," Joe said, pulling on her coat. "And check if yours survived, Marshall." "Nathan," he reminded her with a small smile, "and I'll come with you." Need to start rebuilding my strength. Joe wanted to argue, but recognized the determination in his eyes. She'd feel the same in his position, hating dependency, needing to reclaim self-sufficiency. Stay inside, Joe instructed Sarah firmly. We won't be long. Outside, the world was transformed into a blinding white expanse. The snow had drifted against the cabin walls, nearly reaching the windows in places. Joe's makeshift lean-to had protected her horse adequately, and Nathan's mount had survived as well, though looking decidedly disgruntled about the whole experience. As they tended the animals, Joe felt Nathan watching her. What? She asked finally. I'm just wondering what your plans are. I told you. Take the girl to the authorities, collect my bounty, and move on. Nathan then looked toward the cabin. She's attached to you. Children adapt quickly. She'll attach to whoever cares for her next. Is that what you want for her? To be passed along like unwanted baggage? Joe turned on him sharply. What would you have me do? I'm a bounty hunter, not a mother. I live on the road, tracking killers and thieves. What kind of life is that for a child? Maybe the question is what kind of life it is for you, he replied quietly. Before Joe could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the crisp air. They both tensed, hands moving to weapons. Get inside, Nathan ordered, drawing his revolver. Joe had returned it once she deemed him trustworthy. It could be anyone. Or could be exactly who we've been worried about, Joe countered, already moving through the snow toward the cabin door. Sarah's alone in there. They reached the cabin just as two riders appeared at the edge of the clearing. Joe entered first, finding Sarah exactly where they'd left her. Under the floor, Joe directed, pointing to the loose board where Eddie had hidden his money. Now, Sarah, be quick and quiet. The girl obeyed instantly, slipping into the small space beneath the cabin. Joe replaced the board just as Nathan positioned himself by the window. There are two men, he confirmed in a low voice. Armed. One matches Silas Grady's description. Joe checked her revolver. How do you want to play this? Cautious. They might just be travelers seeking shelter. In this exact cabin? Don't be naive. The approaching men stopped their horses outside. From their voices, Joe could tell they were arguing. I'm telling you, this is Tate's place, the deeper voice insisted. His horse is right there in that lean-to. Along with two others, the second man pointed out. Someone's here, Silas. Joe and Nathan exchanged glances, confirmation if they needed it. I'll take the lead, Nathan said, adjusting his marshal's badge so it was clearly visible. You cover me. A heavy knock rattled the door. Hello, the cabin. Anyone home? Nathan opened the door, standing tall despite the pain Joe knew he must still feel. Marshal Reed, gentlemen? What brings you out in this weather? The two men on the porch exchanged quick glances. The taller one, Silas, apparently spoke first. Begging your pardon, Marshal. We're looking for a friend who has property in these parts. Eddie Tate, have you seen him? Can't say that I have, Nathan replied easily. Been sheltering from the blizzard. This is your friend's cabin, then? That's right. The second man, presumably Hank Weber, chimed in. Eddie said we could use it whenever we needed to. Do you mind if we come in? Cold as a witch's heart out here. Nathan stepped back, allowing them entry. Joe remained in the shadows, her gun hand hidden in the folds of her skirt. The men entered, stamping snow from their boots. Both wore heavy coats and had the hardened look of men accustomed to violence. Silas's eyes focused on the sight of Joe. Didn't know Eddie was entertaining, he remarked. I'm not entertaining anyone, Joe replied coldly. Just waiting out the storm. Silas studied the cabin, gaze lingering on the bed where Eddie had died. Weber moved casually toward the stove, but Joe noted how his eyes scanned every corner. Strange that Eddie ain't here, Silas said. His horse is outside. The previous occupant left in a hurry, it seems, Nathan offered. The cabin was empty when I arrived. And who might you be, ma'am? Weber asked Joe. Someone who doesn't answer questions from strangers, she replied. Silas laughed, but his eyes remained cold. Feisty? You two together, then? He glanced between Joe and Nathan. Just fellow travelers, Nathan said smoothly. The lady was kind enough to tend my wound when I arrived half frozen. Wounded, huh? Silas's hand moved subtly closer to his holstered gun. How'd that happen, Marshal? Ambush. Two cowards shot me from behind after the Clearwater robbery. The tension in the room thickened. Weber had positioned himself near the loose floorboard. though he showed no sign of knowing its significance. "Terrible thing, that robbery," Silas said, watching Nathan carefully. "Heard a man was killed." "James Coleman," Nathan confirmed. "Left behind a wife and daughter." "Tragic," Silas murmured, not sounding remotely concerned. His gaze fell on the wooden horse that Sarah had left on the table. He picked it up, turning it over to reveal the name carved on the bottom. "Sarah," he read aloud, his tone changing. "Now that's interesting." Joe's hand tightened on her revolver. "It belonged to the previous occupant, I imagine." "Funny coincidence," Silas remarked. "The dead man's daughter was named Sarah, too." A soft thump came from beneath the floorboards. It was barely audible, but in the tense silence it might as well have been a gunshot. Weber's eyes darted to the floor. "What was that?" "Rats," Joe said immediately. "The place is infested." Silas wasn't listening. His focus had narrowed, predatory instinct aroused. "You know what I think?" "I think Eddie Tate is dead. And I think you two know exactly where that little girl is." Everything happened at once. Silas drew his gun toward Nathan. Joe's revolver appeared in her hand, firing twice in rapid succession. Weber lunged for the loose floorboard. Nathan tackled him, both men crashing into the table. Joe's first shot caught Silas in the shoulder, spinning him but not stopping him. His return fire went wide as he staggered, but his second shot caught Joe high in her left arm. The pain was immediate and searing, but she kept her weapon steady, firing again. This time, Silas fell. Across the room, Nathan and Weber grappled on the floor. Despite his injury, Nathan fought with desperate strength, knowing what lay beneath that floorboard. Weber slammed a fist into Nathan's wounded side, drawing a cry of pain. The outlaw reached for his fallen gun. Joe's bullet caught him in the back before his fingers could close around the weapon. The sudden silence was deafening. Joe pressed her hand against her bleeding arm, moving quickly to check both fallen men. Silas was dead, her second shot having found his heart. Weber still breathed, but the wound was fatal. It would be a matter of minutes at most. "The girl?" Weber gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "Where?" "Somewhere you'll never touch her," Joe replied coldly, his eyes glazed. "Tate was soft. Shouldn't have taken her. Just a job." Then he was gone. Nathan pulled himself up, pressing a hand to his reopened wound. "Sarah," he called hoarsely, moving toward the loose floorboard. Joe was there first, prying up the board with her good arm. "Sarah? It's safe now. You can come out." The child emerged slowly, eyes enormous in her pale face. She took in the bodies on the floor, then looked up at Joe's bleeding arm. Without hesitation, she moved to Joe's side, small hand reaching up to touch the wound with gentle concern. "I'm all right," Joe assured her, surprised by the child's show of worry. "It's just a scratch." Nathan gave a pained laugh. "Some scratch." "Here, let me help." While Sarah watched anxiously, Nathan cleaned and bandaged Joe's arm. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone. It was painful but not life-threatening. "Guess we're even now," Joe remarked as he tied off the bandage. "Not quite," he replied, his voice serious. "You saved my life." "And Sarah's." Joe looked away, uncomfortable with his gratitude. "We should bury these two and get moving tomorrow. The town's a 3 days' ride if the trails are passable." "And then?" Nathan asked quietly. Joe glanced at Sarah, who had retreated to the corner with her wooden horse and rag doll. The child who hadn't spoken a word in their presence was now humming softly to her toys. It was a small but significant sign of healing. "Then I collect my bounty," Joe said firmly, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. They departed at dawn, leaving the cabin and its grim memories behind. Eddie's body and those of his former partners had been buried in shallow graves marked only by stones. Joe had collected identification and proof of their deaths for the bounties, practical to the end. The journey to Riverbend would take 3 days through snow-covered trails. They traveled single file, Nathan leading with Sarah secured before him on his horse, Joe bringing up the rear. The child seemed comfortable with the marshal now, occasionally pointing at wildlife tracks in the snow. They made camp the first night in a sheltered grove. Sarah fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's travel. Joe took first watch, sitting near the fire with her wounded arm cradled against her body. Nathan joined her, offering coffee from a dented tin cup. "How's the arm?" "It hurts," Joe admitted, but I've had worse." They sat in silence, the barriers between them having dissolved somewhere between gunfights and bandaging each other's wounds. "My sister Emily lives in Riverbend," Nathan said eventually. "She's a good woman." never had children of her own. She'd take Sarah in and give her a proper home. Jo ignored the unexpected tightness in her chest. That would be best for the girl. Would it? Nathan studied her over the rim of his cup. She trusts you, Jo. You might be the first person she's trusted since her parents died. Children are resilient. She'll adjust. Like you adjusted? After your husband was killed? Jo's head snapped up. How do you know about Daniel? It's my job to know about people. Nathan's voice was gentle. They say you were a schoolteacher before, that you started hunting bounties after the men who murdered your husband walked free from court. Jo stared into the fire, memories she usually kept locked away rising to the surface. 3 men broke into our home. Daniel tried to protect me. They shot him while I watched, then took everything we had. Her voice hardened. The judge was related to one of them. All 3 walked free, so I tracked them down myself. And delivered your own justice, Nathan finished. I delivered them to proper authorities in another jurisdiction, Jo corrected, with evidence that couldn't be ignored. They hanged. She looked up at him defiantly, and I found I had a talent for hunting men who deserved catching. So you became the Black Widow? Deadlier than any man with a badge. It was just a job, Jo said, but they both knew it was more, a purpose, a mission, a way to channel grief and rage into something that resembled justice. And now? He asked quietly. Jo glanced at Sarah's sleeping form. Now I finish this job. Collect the bounties. Move on. Is that what you want? The question lingered between them, unanswered. By the 3rd day, Sarah had begun speaking. Single words at first, then short phrases, primarily directed at Jo. Water, she would request, or look, rabbit, pointing at tracks in the snow. Each word felt like a gift, a piece of the child emerging from behind walls of trauma. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Riverbend, Jo felt an unfamiliar reluctance. The small town nestled in the valley represented the end of this unexpected journey and a return to the solitary existence she'd built for herself. The marshal's office first, Nathan directed as they rode down the main street. I need to file reports on Tate and his partners. The town was typical frontier, a main street lined with essential businesses and side streets with modest homes. People stopped to stare at the unusual procession. The silver-badged marshal, a small girl, and a woman whose bearing and weapons marked her as someone dangerous. Inside the marshal's office, Deputy Gibson gaped at their appearance. Marshal Reed. We thought you were dead. Not quite, Nathan replied dryly, though not for lack of trying on Grady and Weber's part. As Nathan gave his report, Jo stood awkwardly with Sarah clinging to her good arm. The child had become increasingly anxious as they approached town, sensing change coming. And the girl? Deputy Clark asked, eyeing Sarah with pity. That's Sarah Coleman, Nathan confirmed. She is sole witness to her father's murder and sole surviving member of her family. Poor little thing, the deputy murmured. The orphanage in Helena is the closest place for children without kin. Jo felt Sarah's grip tighten painfully on her arm. The child looked up at her with fear in her eyes. There are alternatives, Nathan interjected smoothly. My sister Emily might take her in, and Miss Clark here has been caring for her these past 10 days. Deputy Clark's eyebrows rose as he took in Jo's hard appearance. The bounty hunter? Caring for a child? Jo bristled. She's been through enough without being sent to an orphanage, deputy. Her vehemence surprised even herself. The deputy raised his hands in surrender. Just surprised is all. You're not exactly known for nurturing. I'll take the bounty vouchers now, Jo said coldly, placing the documentation of Eddie Tate's death on the desk. 3 men. Tate, Grady, and Weber. While the deputy processed the paperwork, Jo crouched down to Sarah's level. You'll be staying with the marshal's sister for a while, she explained, keeping her voice steady. She's a kind woman who will take good care of you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I want you to stay too, she whispered. It was the first complete sentence Jo had heard from her. Jo swallowed hard. I can't, Sarah. I have work to do. Taking bad men away, Sarah said, showing her understanding of Jo's explanations during their journey. That's right. But I need you, the child said simply. Jo had no answer that wouldn't shatter them both. Emily Reed's home was small but comfortable, with colorful curtains and the smell of fresh bread. The widow welcomed them warmly, embracing her brother with careful attention to his wound. "And this must be Sarah," she said gently, kneeling before the child. "Nathan's told me what a brave girl you are." Sarah pressed closer to Joe's side, saying nothing. "She's shy," Joe explained, feeling protective of the child's silence. "But she's speaking more each day." Emily nodded understandingly. "There's no rush, Sarah. You'll talk when you're ready. Would you like to see your room? I've put fresh linens on the bed and found some books that might interest you." Sarah looked up at Joe, seeking permission or reassurance. "Go ahead," Joe encouraged, though the words felt like stones in her mouth. "I'll be right here." As Emily led Sarah through the house, Nathan touched Joe's elbow lightly. "Emily will be good to her." "I know." Joe's voice was tight. "Your sister seems kind." "She is." Nathan hesitated. "Joe, you don't have to leave immediately. You could stay a few days, help Sarah adjust." The offer was tempting, dangerously so. "It's better to make the break clean," Joe replied, more harshly than she intended. "She needs to attach to your sister, not cling to me." "And what do you need?" Joe had no answer. For 10 years, her needs had been simple: justice, solitude, purpose. Now, watching Sarah's small form disappear into what would become her new home, Joe felt adrift in unfamiliar emotional waters. When Sarah and Emily returned to the sitting room, the child was clutching a book. She came directly to Joe, holding it up. "Will you read to me?" she asked in her small voice. Joe looked at Nathan helplessly. "I think that's a fine idea," he said. "Why don't you read to Sarah while Emily and I prepare supper?" Left alone with the child, Joe settled awkwardly on the sofa. Sarah immediately climbed into her lap, mindful of her wounded arm, and opened the book. It was a collection of fairy tales. Joe began to read, her voice gradually softening from its usual clipped tones. Sarah leaned against her chest, small fingers occasionally reaching up to touch Joe's cheek, as if assuring herself that Joe was really there. From the kitchen doorway, Nathan watched silently, his expression thoughtful. "So you're leaving then?" Nathan asked as Joe saddled her horse early the next morning. She nodded, tightening the cinch with her good arm. "Bounties are collected." "There is nothing to keep me here." "Nothing?" His voice was quiet but intent. Joe turned to face him. The past 2 weeks had changed something between them. It created a connection she hadn't sought but couldn't deny. "What would you have me do, Nathan? Play house with your sister and Sarah? Pretend I'm something I'm not?" "I don't think you know what you are anymore," he replied. "The Black Widow I'd heard about wouldn't have taken a bullet protecting a child. She wouldn't have made her rag dolls or told her bedtime stories." "Perhaps you didn't hear all the stories correctly," Joe retorted. "Perhaps." He stepped closer. "Or perhaps there's more to Josephine Clark than even she remembers." Joe looked away, unable to meet the understanding in his eyes. "Sarah will be better off with a normal life. With your sister." "She woke crying for you 3 times last night," Nathan said softly. "Emily did her best, but the child wants you, Joe." Pain lanced through Joe's chest. It was sharper than any bullet wound. "She'll forget me in time." "Like you forgot Daniel?" "Some bonds can't be broken, Joe. They can only be honored or denied." Before Joe could formulate a response, the sound of running feet made them both turn. Sarah burst into the stable, still in her nightgown, Emily following behind with an apologetic expression. "You're leaving," Sarah accused, tears streaming down her face as she ran to Joe. "You promised to stay." Joe crouched down, catching the child gently. "I never promised that, Sarah. I said I'd get you somewhere safe, and I have. I want to go with you." The child's fingers clutched at Joe's coat desperately. "You can't, sweetheart." The endearment slipped out unbidden. "My life isn't suitable for a child." "Then change it," Sarah demanded with surprising vehemence. "Stay here." Joe looked up helplessly, meeting Nathan's steady gaze over the child's head. "You could, you know," he said quietly. "Riverbend needs a deputy marshal, someone who knows how to track criminals and isn't afraid to face danger." Joe blinked, momentarily speechless. "A female deputy?" "The town would never accept it." "The town would accept someone who helped bring James Coleman's killers to justice and saved his orphaned daughter," Nathan countered, "especially if the current marshal recommended her." "I work alone," Joe protested weakly. "You've been alone for 10 years, Nathan said. "How's that working for you?" Sarah's tear-streaked face turned up to Joe's. "Please, she whispered. I need you. Looking into those pleading eyes, Jo felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumbling. She'd been running for so long, from grief, from attachment, from the possibility of loss. But in running, she'd missed this. The fierce, terrifying joy of being needed, of belonging. I don't know how to be anything but what I am, Jo admitted, as much to herself as to Nathan. Nobody's asking you to be anything but yourself, he replied. Just to consider that maybe yourself includes more than you've allowed for a long time. Jo looked down at Sarah, then back to Nathan. She thought of the cabin, of reading stories by firelight, of 3 people finding unexpected connection in the midst of danger. She thought of returning to endless solitary travels, hunting men whose names and crimes would eventually blur together. The deputy position, she said finally. Is it official? Nathan's slow smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains. It can be by noon. Sarah's arms tightened around Jo's neck. Are you staying? She asked, hope trembling in her voice. Jo drew a breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. Then she smiled, making the leap into the unknown. I'm staying. 6 months later, Deputy Marshal Josephine Clark sat at her desk in the Riverbend Law Office, reviewing wanted posters. Her wounded arm had healed well, leaving only a puckered scar to match the collection she'd acquired over years of bounty hunting. The door opened, admitting Sarah in her school dress, a book strap clutched in one hand. At nearly 8 years old, the formerly mute child now chattered constantly, making up for lost time. School's out early, she announced. Miss Price has a toothache. Jo smiled, still marveling at the transformation in the traumatized girl she'd found beneath a table half a year ago. Is Emily expecting you home? She said I could come see if you want to practice shooting with me. Sarah's eyes gleamed with anticipation. Jo had begun teaching her to handle a small pistol. It was for protection, she insisted, though Nathan teased that it was because Jo couldn't imagine a female not knowing how to shoot. Let me finish this report first, Jo agreed, returning to her paperwork. Sarah settled in the chair opposite, watching Jo with open admiration. The child had flourished in the unconventional arrangement they'd established. She lived primarily with Emily, but spent significant time with Jo. The 3 women had created a makeshift family structure that suited them all. The office door opened again, admitting Marshal Reed, trail dust still clinging to his coat from his journey. Nathan? Sarah jumped up to greet him with an enthusiastic hug. Did you catch the horse thieves? All 3, he confirmed, ruffling her hair affectionately. Your mother's tracking skills came in handy. They were exactly where she said they'd cross the river. Jo still startled slightly at being called Sarah's mother, though the child had begun using the term naturally a few months ago. Emily had shown no jealousy, seeming genuinely happy that Sarah had found her place between them. I got a telegram while I was in Durango, Nathan continued, removing an envelope from his pocket. New bounty. $500 for Jacob Winters. He was last seen heading north from Colorado. Jo took the paper, scanning the details. Once, the challenge of a difficult tracking job would have sent her riding out immediately. Now she felt only a measured professional interest. We could pick up his trail at Carson's Pass, she noted, probably within a week. Sarah's face fell. You're leaving? Jo looked from the wanted poster to the child's crestfallen expression, then to Nathan's carefully neutral face. She folded the paper deliberately and tucked it into her desk drawer. No, she decided. Let the federal marshals handle this one. I promised someone shooting lessons this afternoon. The radiant smile that broke across Sarah's face was worth more than any bounty. Nathan's expression warmed with approval and something deeper that had been growing between them over the months. Something neither had rushed to name but both acknowledged in quiet moments. As they left the office together, Jo felt Sarah's small hand slip into hers. On her other side, Nathan's fingers brushed against hers briefly, a gentle touch that spoke volumes. The fearsome Black Widow bounty hunter had hung up her lone wolf reputation, and Josephine Clark had found her way home. To the family she never expected and the future she never dared imagine. The most unlikely bounty of all, and the only one worth keeping.